Now on to our next session. So transparency, or lack of, has been flagged as a barrier to investment to the programmatic ecosystem for a number of years. Many stakeholders, technologies, and organizations have made changes to increase transparency. The next panel is going to debate, have we done enough to deliver? Transparency in the programmatic chain. Or sorry, have we done enough to deliver transparency in the programmatic supply chain? So I'm delighted to introduce the moderator for this next session, Clem Piazza, is the programmatic director for EMEA at Integral Ad Science. Again, don't forget to submit your questions for the panel using the Q&A box. Over to you, Clem.
Thanks a lot, David. I hope you can all hear me, although my earphones are not as cool as yours, but yeah, I'll try my best. So good morning, everyone. This is Clementina, or just Clem, as David mentioned. I'm Programmatic Director for EMEA at Integral Ad Science. I also have the pleasure of wearing another hat today as the newly elected chair of IAB Europe Brand Advertising Committee. So thanks again for joining us this morning. And one small note, fear not, if you've got kids entering the room, they are the most welcome, as it's never too early to start thinking about digital marketing. As Daniel Knapp said, new skills are badly needed. So without further ado, the topic of transparency in programmatic is a vast and at times really challenging one, but we are definitely feeling up for the challenge today with such a lineup of speakers. So without further ado, Gavin, Ross, Steve, Emily, and Andrew, it would be great if we could kick off with some introductions from yourselves.
Hi there, my name's Gavin Stewart. I'm a VP of Partner Services at OpenX here in Europe. We are a global programmatic exchange providing scaled access to premium publishers.
Hi, my name's Emily Roberts and I look after programmatic revenue in Europe, Middle East and Africa for BBC Global News.
Ross?
Okay, while we wait for Ross, I'm Steve Wing. I'm the Managing Director or Country Manager for the UK and Nordics at Rubicon Project. It means that I've been here about 5 years, based in London. We are a global programmatic exchange. I'm there to lead the right teams doing the right things across our publisher partners, our agencies and our buying partners.
Go on, Ross, I'll let you have your slot back.
Yeah, we can
Yep, am I okay?
Yep.
I'm Ross Webster. I'm the Managing Director of Foursquare, and Foursquare is an independent location data platform for understanding how people are moving in the real world.
Brilliant.
And hi, I'm Andrew Buckman. I'm CEO of Sublime, and Sublime is a global high-impact ad tech specialist, and we create and deliver brand ad experiences at scale.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. So I'd like to kick off with the consideration that, I mean, transparency is not really, a new theme per se. There's been a lot of talking about transparency around many different angles. So my question basically is, if we're still talking about transparency, are we really confident as an industry that we've identified the key issues? And if not, what else needs to be done? So I don't know if Gavin, perhaps you want to start tackling this?
Sure. So, I mean, I think over the years, the definition of transparency has changed quite a lot. I think if you go back to the early years where ad networks were a very large part of a lot of buys, a lot of the time transparency referred to the placement of ads on sites, what sites they appeared on, and whether that was visible to the person making the buy. Over time, as the marketplace has become more complex, as programmatic has become a major technique used by marketers to buy media, the focus has kind of shifted more towards the mechanics that's going on in the background, and whether those mechanics are fair and transparent and understood by the buyer and indeed by the seller. There has also been a greater focus on the transparency of financial agreements. Historically, financial agreements were not always completely transparent. In fact, a lot of the time they were not at all transparent. And we are increasingly moving to a world where it's important particularly for larger buyers, for them to understand exactly how hard their dollar is working for them. So I feel like we have kind of got to a point where we know what the major issues are that need to be addressed. And we also have a number of initiatives that are running to address those issues. The trade bodies are working very hard, from ISBA, IAB, AOP. There's numerous initiatives going on. There's numerous companies out there that can work on and provide transparency to what's going on in the programmatic ecosystem. So I think we're in a better place in terms of understanding what the issues are, but clearly there's more work to be done to gain the complete confidence of the marketers at the top of the chain, who will still make somewhat concerning remarks about how transparent they feel the industry is.
Cool. And Steve, would you like to add something around that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to probably unhelpfully agree with Gavin, but I normally do. I think the fact we're on a panel talking about transparency shows you that despite a lot of fantastic work, there's still work to be done. And I think it's as well to reflect upon the fact, as you mentioned in your intro, this is a huge area, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And there's everything from supply chain transparency, so how do we follow the money through the marketplace, all the way through to transparency of auction dynamics, industry standards, fraud mitigation, brand safety, even onto the right of open source code bases and movements like pre-bid, which are designed now to create open, collaborative, inspectable standards with transparency baked in at the start. So it's a really big area. I think we've been good in defining those areas. And I think it's also, to Gavin's point, we should reflect just briefly on a lot of the work that has gone done, because it's easy to forget how many years people have been working really hard to address this issue, because we all believe that transparency grows the market and is an absolute necessity. So everything from the IAB FAQs that were launched in 2019, we're going to talk a little bit later, I think, about the IAB Europe's supply transparency report, ads.txt, apps.ads.txt, supply chain optic through to sellers.json, through to IAB Gold Standard with JIT Webs, the industry initiatives that Gavin's referred to. This has been a ton of best practice going on. We have our agency partners who are as interested in our requirements and our sort of best practice around transparency as they are around our capabilities, our tools, and our supply. So yeah, there's a ton of good stuff that's gone on. Obviously, there's lots to do, but I think we're all aligned on that. So Gavin and I might compete for share of mind and share of revenue with our customers, but we understand that transparency is a core component of growing overall confidence in this marketplace with current participants and future participants. So I think we'd give ourselves probably a B+, A- for effort, maybe an A for effort. We definitely are not there yet. There's still work to be done, but we shouldn't underestimate just how many initiatives are taking place and how committed a lot of people are to solving this problem.
Fantastic. And since you've mentioned Gavin again, not to, keep picking on you or your brain, Gavin, I would like to hear your thoughts on, so Steve mentioned there's a lot that's been done. So, with the aim of giving, as many pragmatic information as possible to our listeners, I would like to hear from you which industry initiatives you think have made the most difference. You can tackle it from, your own personal view, you can tackle it from, your own your company's perspective, but I'm curious to hear your take on that.
Yep. So I think there's probably a combination of a couple of things that, when combined, provide a very high degree of transparency and it holds everyone in the chain to a very high standard. The first, which is not, it's not widely used on the buy side, is the supply chain object. It is very important to understand the chain of relationships that sit between the buyer and the ultimate end seller. When you introduce resellers, and more so multiple resellers into the chain, we all know that money starts to disappear off the table that's not necessarily visible at the DSP level, which is the buy side's interface into the ecosystem. So the supply chain object is a very helpful tool to help to start to shine a light onto the path that an ad takes on to get in front of the consumer. I think on top of that, it's not necessarily an industry standard, but it's becoming increasingly common to see agreements being made between companies to provide a greater degree of transparency than maybe comes through any industry initiative. I don't know if we'll get to a stage where any industry initiatives mandate complete financial transparency, but certainly I think where credible and skilled buyers have got good relationships both on the DSP side and on the exchange side, we're starting to see a lot more of buyers kind of saying, look, if you want to see my dollar, then you're going to have to provide more comfort that everything's happening as we understand it. And so that combination of financial transparency as well as supply chain transparency is probably the greatest set of tools that a buyer can have to make sure they understand what's going on.
Fantastic. And, you know, from what you just, you know, the way you just responded and in general, I mean, when I personally see the issue of or issues around transparency being raised, I always get an impression that the issue or issues around transparency seem to be very much a thing of the buy side. And you see headlines and issues around brand safety, fraud, lack of transparency, how they're impacting consumer trust, and as you said, you know, brand investment. So what is, you know, and at the same time, we just mentioned all the things that are currently being done to improve things. So I would like to kind of extend and maybe, you know, Ross, pick your brain on, you know, is it only a buy side issue, right? The issue around transparency, and what is, again, like a comment from you on what is making a real difference in moving concerns, you know, further, or, you know, solving the concerns that we've had on the table for a while now.
Yeah, so from our point of view, yes, I mean, you know, there have been big strides, just to build on Gavin and Steve's point. And it seems that there has been a general desire across the whole ecosystem to clean it up. From the buy side and the sell side, there seems to be a drive for greater transparency. And I guess, you know, peer-driven initiatives like TCF, the IAB's TCF program, is an indication of that. And you would hope that the main priority should be down the line. We should be thinking about the users and the consumers as actually the people that should feel secure that we are being doing the right thing around their privacy and what we're doing with their data. But my big worry is the fact that even though you know, a lot of companies are, you know, are following this, that there's some well-founded proof. There's also some that are not, and there seems to be, whether it be through commercial pressures or whether it be through a misreading of the required standards, that a lot of companies are probably abusing the system, manipulating, obscuring it, whether that be, you know, stuff like you see examples of people hard coding consent strings, that there are workarounds. And I think probably the most important thing is actually to see that the regulations are being policed properly. So whether it be the ICO, who are obviously tackling this, or whether it's through CNIL in France, and ultimately probably organizations like the IAB that could actually police it, to investigate and sort of obviously deal with the bad actors in the market.
Fantastic. And I think, you know, in moving on to a couple of other themes that I would like to explore with you today, there's a question that came up around, you know, what is exactly that we mean by transparency? I think, you know, again, as I kind of caveated at the beginning, this is such a vast topic, but the concept of transparency, like the definition of transparency in general, right, is about having a common playing field where, you know, everyone as much as possible and in their different capacity have, you know, all the information or equal access to information that they need to, you know, pursue and complete the action that they need to complete, you know, whatever the function is that they cover in the ecosystem. And I think for this reason, you know, some of the initiatives have been made around, actually advising the different parties of the ecosystem in what are the correct, or, where to start from in terms of like asking questions, right? What should be their priorities? Like, what is, the access that they need to have in order to fulfill their function to their highest potential? And, one of the resources around that I find extremely useful, and I think readers find it too, otherwise we wouldn't have got to the third edition, is the IAB Europe Supply Chain Transparency Guide. And around that, I would like to pick Andrew's brain for a second. And just, Andrew, if you can summarize a little bit for everyone listening, what is the IAB Europe Supply Chain Transparency Guide, and who was it developed by and for, and just, why is it such a useful piece of documentation? I think you're on mute.
I am on mute, yes, sorry.
There you go.
Obviously don't spend enough time on video conferences at the moment. Thanks for that. So yeah, it is, as you're saying, it is a really important document, and Steve and I have been discussing this. I think that Steve's going to add a few points in a second, but it's a document really, and it's actually more than just a document. It's really a guide to the kind of questions that you need to ask to be sure about transparency. And it's really to be able to identify actually what transparency means to you as well. So, and it's important because there's more than a third of buyers who think that transparency is a barrier to investment today. And then when you talk about ad tech vendors, that rises up to over half of them. And it's important that we can actually get questions that help each stakeholder category in the whole of the programmatic supply chain, from the buyer through to the seller, to actually make sure there's consistent transparency. So if we're all asking the same questions and asking the same questions in the same way, then we'll always be able to get the right kind of answers. It was first launched in a couple of years ago in 2018, and is updated every 6 to 8 months by the IAB Europe Programmatic Trading Committee. And I'm not sure, Steve, if you've got any other kind of points that you wanted to add onto this.
I just think it comes back to the original premise, Phil. We're having a panel to discuss transparency and what are the ways in which we can help people have a level of comfort and understanding that what they want to do, how they want to transact, how they want to make stuff available, they completely understand. And Gavin mentioned being held to a higher bar of account from, let's say, our agency partners. I think it's completely correct. What this does is it's a really, really good guide that allows people a shortcut to best practice. So if you are an agency or a DSP or you're a publisher and you want to work with certain people, what are the questions you should be asking? What are the questions that any responsible player in this ecosystem should want to answer? And they're tough questions, and they're rightfully so. So it's a really handy guide. I'd argue that the color coordination on it is not great, but that's just a thing. But in terms of its availability, it's just another example of all the stuff we mentioned at the start, which is lots of people working really hard to try and make people understand where they can go to get the answers to the questions they need. It shouldn't be this hard, but it's a fantastic guide. As like I say, it's a shortcut to best practice. It allows everybody in this marketplace to hold everyone to the highest best practice and standard of account, which is only proper, really.
Fantastic. And I've seen, again, a question popping up around sharing the link to the guide. We will definitely circulate the link to the guide. And if you go onto IAB Europe's website, in the resources section, you can find it as one of the most recent piece of documentation created. So we said, I think, transparency is a wide topic. Transparency means, something different for each single party in the ecosystem. And, we've pointed out, a couple of examples of what that could mean, differently from which kind of position you occupy in the ecosystem. We've mentioned the guide as, a great starting point to have a repository of questions that in your function you should be asking to get all the information ultimately that probably allow you to complete, your task, your job. So moving a little bit along, we wouldn't, I think it would be a bit blind not to, mention the times that we are currently living. So in such a critical and quite dramatic time of history, I think we're gonna just start a poll here to stop and think for a second and get your opinion as listeners, whether the current situation we are in has kind of changed the perspective around, this kind of topic. So is transparency as, important right now, or there's other things that we should be thinking about? So how's this current situation with COVID-19 changed the priority of such, a topic that has been so prominent in recent time before, the situation that we're in? And I guess at this time, a poll should magically appear on screen. Yes, there you go. That was swift. So we'll give you a couple of minutes and then if I remember my instructions correctly, I shall be able to read out the response. I still see it on screen. So I guess we're still going.
We can't vote. What kind of democracy is this?
Exactly. Thinking about transparency. No, I'm joking. All right. So poll results. Actually, so we've got as response that 39% think that is more of a priority. 53% think that transparency is as much of a priority as it was before the current situation kind of kicked in, and 8% think that is less of a priority. So I think this gives me a great cue to actually, again, pick your brains on, around this topic. So how does COVID-19 impact the transparency discussion? And is it, what do you think, since we weren't allowed to vote, right? What do you think? Is it more or less important? And maybe, Steve, do you want to take this one?
I mean, yeah, I feel like, from my point of view, obviously we are living through unprecedented times. So our immediate priorities have shifted, and, making sure that ourselves, the people we work with, our loved ones are safe is probably top of the pile. When we discussed this originally, I was firmly in the camp. So I'm glad the vote has gone my way. Not that that's important, that this is as if not more important. So yes, I say immediate priorities might make some of it hard to get to the top of the list, but trust in this marketplace and the impact we've talked about on subsequent investment in the future, that's not going to change. And if anything, the scrutiny of marketeers and brands and publishers to ensure they can get through this period, I think makes transparency even more important. So certainly from my perspective, the conversations I'm having around this are not easing up. People really want to understand better certain areas, they want to sign agreements, they want to do things. So I think that's fantastic, but I'll let other people chime in.
Sure. Anyone, Gavin, Ross, Emily, Andrew, do you want to add to this? What's your thoughts?
So I was definitely in the losing camp. I guess chiming off what Steve just said, I do think priorities have shifted slightly. I don't think transparency is any less important. I still think people care deeply about transparency, both from the demand side and from the supply side. But I do think that COVID clearly creates just a maze of challenges, some of which are completely to be expected, and some of which probably catch us all by surprise. And I think just the nature of kind of dealing with all of these fires or issues or just things, as well as the fact that I think we all probably are slightly more caring people than we've ever been before. Priorities have shifted a little bit. And I do think transparency has slipped down the agenda a little bit. I don't think it's any less important, though.
Cool. Ross, do you want to add anything on this?
I guess I would agree that it shouldn't be any less important in the current sort of days we live in. I guess from our point of view, our conversations have very much slipped into privacy issues. Being a location company, we've obviously started to work a lot with governmental and NGOs around how to understand people's movements in the current sort of, in lockdown. So I guess sort of for us, it's thrown up sort of questions about sort of privacy and what we can share and what we can't share. And I would say that we haven't changed our philosophy on the importance of making sure that the user's privacy is absolute. I guess sort of going forward, obviously we'll be working with brands a lot more to help them understand what the new normal looks like. But I don't think it's going to change our, it hasn't changed our philosophy around transparency and the privacy issues at all.
Thank you. And sticking to the topic, infamous topic, obviously, of coronavirus. So coronavirus is becoming an increasingly blacklisted term. So I would like to pick Emily's brain on, so do you think is necessary to, have this kind of approach towards blocking coronavirus as a term, and how do we ensure that we continue to fund quality journalism? I know this is a topic quite dear, obviously, to your heart. So yeah, I would really like to hear your take on this.
I think so. Blocking coronavirus, there's two things. There's two main elements. From kind of BBC's perspective, although a lot of the news around coronavirus has been negative, we've had some incredible stories, and I think everybody in our daily lives would agree that the kind of amazing kind of community spirit that's come out has just been incredible. And it's things like Captain Tom, who's just about to reach £30 million today. And we've done an amazing article about all the incredible street art that's popping up for the NHS, the 8 PM clap on a Thursday, like all incredibly inspiring news stories are sadly being blocked because people are just blocking coronavirus. So that's the first point. But I think the second point is we've found, and what's really frustrating for us, is that not only people are blocking coronavirus, they're blocking the whole of news. And so that has a severe impact when your name is BBC Global News. And so that's really frustrating, because a lot of other publishers out there will not only do news, but they'll do a lot of feature sites as well. So for instance, we have a lot of amazing feature sites like our business site or culture site, travel, which or sports, which again has been affected, but they don't focus on coronavirus at all, and yet actually the whole of our site is being blocked, and it's super frustrating, because some of the articles that are coming out of those feature sites, our feature sites are actually up by 30% in terms of the volume of people coming to them, because people are obviously going to the news and then they're going onwards. But it is a challenge. We've basically broken every record in the book, which is incredible. BBC is kind of, I think most people would agree, especially in the UK, it's the place that people have come, whether it's on the TV or whether it's online, to understand what is going on. And we've been classed as kind of the fifth emergency service right around the world. And it's a massive challenge when we've had record-breaking weeks, bigger than like any other time since the BBC went online, which is insane. And yet, because advertisers are blocking our content, it means the revenue isn't kind of mirroring that. And so I guess that's super frustrating. I think it's also, so on to your second point about kind of funding quality journalism, and I know Matthew spoke about it on the previous call, but I think there's a really, really important, and this comes back to transparency as well, and I don't think anyone's mentioned it, where actually we should be talking about the consumer. The consumer is the most important thing. And like being part of the BBC, we put our, because obviously, I mean, that's the purpose of BBC News, is to basically ensure that everyone gets unbiased and impartial news. And that's so, so important. And so for us, I think there is we have to ensure that we are basically making sure that our people understand our advertising and kind of how we're making that revenue. And it was only until kind of GDPR and e-privacy came out, that people actually started to realize, oh wait, publishers are actually taking our data, there's actually a kind of almost like a currency for this, and started to kind of make people realize and question where they wanted to accept cookies or not. And obviously that's going to go further and further when we have like opt-out over the next few months or years. But I think that's super important, that our readers understand why it's so important that we have advertising, and to kind of make sure that they understand what that's for. And also I like that's going to be a new currency in a way. So I think when we talk about transparency, it's always going to be consumer first. So yeah.
Thanks a lot, Emily. And Andrew, do you want to add anything around this?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I just definitely want to echo what Emily's saying. Is just the general frustration by all sort of news providers and quality journalists, because it's, I mean, this is really the time where their work is actually being more appreciated than general. I mean, where people actually do have time to read in-depth articles and opinion pieces about what's going on, which helps them form their opinions and helps them fully understand what the big picture is, rather than just going through life, as I'm sure we always do, just getting sound bites and getting sort of just quick one paragraph condensed aspects of the news. Here we in the general public have got real time to actually dig deep into the news, and there's so much quality journalism out there. And we see with all of the publishers that we work with that their whole sites are just blanket banned and blocked by advertisers, despite, as Emily was saying, there being travel content or sport content or fashion or anything else. And up until about March, or last month, March was only last month, feels like last year, Trump, I think, was the most popular blacklist keyword. And then coronavirus took it over now, and there's more than 3,100 advertisers who are blocking it. And I think, Clem, you might be familiar with that, because I read that on an Integral Ad Science press release, I think. But there was another study that was done by GumGum, and they've looked at nearly 3 million web pages, and they've seen that over 60% of those web pages have actually, which have got COVID-19 related keywords, are classified as safe. So there's no real reason to just blanket ban coronavirus. And we both as actors in this, and also as an association, we can help by lobbying the government to help, and that does have some effect. I mean, Oliver Dowden, who's our culture secretary, he stepped in and has spoken to advertisers and brands, and says there's a need for pragmatism and to do everything that's possible to prevent this decline in news publishing, which is really starting to relive. I know that the IB, but also Newsworks and the AOP and the IPA have all issued guidance to advertisers and agencies. And we're seeing also some agencies now that are actually taking a stand in this. I've seen that Group M and Universal McCann have advised their clients against blacklisting all coronavirus articles. Because there's so many stories about the positive side and the positive aspect. Of course, brands don't want to be next to stories that are outlining the death tolls in different markets, but you don't want to block the kind of content which actually brings on positive sentiment.
Fantastic. And, one thing, first of all, you guys would be happy to hear or read that we're actually getting quite a lot of questions that I'm afraid we're not going to have time to answer all of them live, but we'll commit to definitely, provide an answer to as part of the follow-ups. So picking up, I think, you got a supporter in the audience, or many, one that came forward and said that, you're 100% right, that it's not necessary to use, keyword exclusion. And I can only vouch for that. I think, one of the, I hope, if there's one thing that you take away from today's sessions overall, is that you have, a team, organizations of experts that are there, ready to support any sort of question or doubt that you might have around the ecosystem with documentations and personally. And there's a lot of companies out there. Obviously, I represent, part of the verification side of things. Like, we're all available, no matter, who you use as a provider, to provide you with guidance of how best, to, make sure that you're not delivering your ads against, content that you might not feel confident, to deliver against, but, that you don't cut off the opportunity to deliver your ads, in very, very meaningful, content, expanding your reach, and most importantly, still funding quality journalism. Because as I said, as I always say, I think, we definitely don't want to be in a place where such important resources get taken away from us because they're not properly funded. So picking a couple of questions from the very extensive list. So I'd like to use, to pick a bit of a controversial one. If I find it again, yes, I do. Okay, so do you feel, and this is open to any one of you obviously that wants to take the answer, do you feel that agencies have a lot to answer for in regards to lack of financial transparency and are using ad tech as an excuse? I feel that we kind of all represent ad tech, or a big part of us represent ad tech in this group. So I'm quite curious to hear what your take is. I think like Gavin hasn't muted himself. I don't know if you want to take this one.
Happy to take a first stab at it. But I think every single person in the supply chain or every single group of companies has at some point done something which has just built on mistrust. Every single part of the value chain feels pressure, has felt pressure, continues to feel pressure as market shares kind of change. And that sometimes pushes different groups into doing things which are not necessarily completely transparent. So I think there have been examples over the years which have been very well publicized where there has been a lack of transparency. I think we're kind of moving past that world. I think from advertisers through agencies into DSPs, exchanges and publishers, I think every single group of companies understands the areas of transparency that affects them and their direct partners. And so we're in a smarter world where people can put paperwork in place to try and address that. I think the entire value chain has a role to play in terms of taking blame for where we are today.
Fair. Is there any further comment on this one? Otherwise, I'm probably going to move on. I've got another couple of questions that popped up that I'm really keen to cover, but I'm very happy to hear if there's anyone else. I think like Andrew has unmuted himself as well. Do you want to add anything around this, Andrew?
No, I just didn't mute myself after the last one.
There you go. You're on the spot now.
I do agree. I do actually agree with Gavin in this respect. So we do all have our part to play in this, and I'm sure. I mean, I've been doing this for over 20 years, and there's this whole ecosystem has evolved and has gone just in trying to run to catch up with technology. Some people take advantage of that. Some people try and sort of run ahead of the curve and find new ways of doing business. I think that we've now all reached a state of consciousness where we realise that we can't just instantly try and take advantage of niches. We need to work together to make sure that everything is treated fairly.
I would add though that I don't think, as Gavin said, I don't think the whole market has been mistrusted. I think the main issue with programmatic is the fact that we've made it so much more complicated than it needs to be, and that's why we end up with loopholes. I don't think people on purpose, well, the majority of people on purpose go around the market trying to mistrust each other. From our perspective, no, I think agencies do an incredibly good job to navigate the market in such a kind of complicated market, and we are seeing now changes being made that are going to help kind of make it easier to navigate, but I think it's just the fact that it's such a complicated market.
Thank you, Emily. And I actually, the other question I wanted to pick was directed to either, you and Ross specifically. So I'm going to pick Ross's brain next. So the question was, Ross, Emily, from your global perspective, is there a difference in market drive for transparency region by region, since we are in a IB Europe forum So Ross, would you be able to comment on this if you've seen anything varying drastically, like from market to market, or any comment around market difference?
No, not really. I think sort of to all the points that are being made today, really, that I think sort of transparency sort of goes beyond the individual market nuances. I think sort of I think every market understands that there is that need. I guess individual markets are react to it differently. You know, whether it be through the regulatory bodies, but no, maybe it's because I'm coming across a lot of the global. I'm dealing mainly with global companies that seem to be taking a global approach in the way that they behave. So I haven't seen any individual nuances. I mean, Emily might well have.
Yeah, I would disagree. I think, so I can only speak for EMEA because that's the region I look after, but I think it varies very differently from region to region. For instance, in the Middle East, their whole transparency is completely different to what you see in kind of Western Europe, and it's the same in Africa as well. In Dubai, they've got a very strange way of doing things in the advertising industry, which may not potentially be the most transparent. I think in Western Europe, we're the most focused about transparency compared to a lot of the other regions. And then in Africa, like especially with South Africa, it's still reasonably quite new, and there's some things that they're jumping ahead of the curve that we obviously went through that they're having to completely avoid now, which is quite nice for them. But yeah, it massively depends. I mean, I could go into further regions, but yeah, I think it massively depends what region you're talking about.
And just, I'm conscious that again we're ourselves a bit over time, but I wanted to cover what was actually one of the first questions that came through in the Q&A. And please, 2 minutes left. See, I've got digital, amazing. So yeah, be trustful of the fact that we're going to be following up to all questions. So if you've been left out in the live discussion, we're going to cover it. Don't worry. So the last point that I wanted to pick your brains on is that, I'm going to merge two questions here. So it's interesting that there is no DSP on the panel, considering the Trade Desk recent announcement. So the Trade Desk recent announcement, I believe it refers to, and that's the reason why I want to pick, some of your brains in particular here. So the Trade Desk recent announcement is about asking SSPs for a single supply path to publish their inventory. So we did try to get a DSP, on the panel, but this is all voluntary time and whatnot, so we can't always, fulfill what we're planning to do. But yeah, so I would like to pick anyone's brain if you want to come forward around, what's your thoughts around this announcement, especially from an SSP perspective or publisher perspective.
I was just going to say, I think it's a really, really good step in the right direction, and it's really interesting speaking to a lot of ad tech vendors how they are now trying to follow suit. There's always somebody in the market that's brave enough to put a step forward, and I think this is a prime example of a company that's put their kind of feet forward and made a big decision. And a lot of the time things can backfire, but I think this is a great step to kind of transparency and to make it a lot more kind of clearer, the ecosystem. And from a publisher's side, I think especially for us and how our ad stack is laid out, it works incredibly well for us. So yeah, I'd like to see more kind of initiatives like that in the industry.
I think as well, talking to one of the points that you made earlier, Emily, a lot of the perhaps transparency and trust issues that have come up in the past have not necessarily come up deliberately. They've come up because of the complexity of technology. And I think one of the things that Trade Desk are looking at doing is simplifying complexity. Through nobody's fault, we've ended up with a multitude of ways to connect to publisher supply. And that does not always appear completely transparently to DSPs, so they don't necessarily understand transparently what's going on. There may be signals as to what connection inventories coming through, but that might not always be visible. And by asking that exchanges pick a single route, I think complexity and efficiency, or well, complexity is removed and efficiency is created, and that creates more transparency in terms of the path from the demand to the supply. And it's a positive thing, to Emily's point. Trade Desk obviously the first to make that choice, and part of, I think, a wider initiative to create a greater degree of transparency in the supply path.
Yeah, and I think it just goes back to the continuum of this conversation, where we started, which is there are lots of things that are going on, and this is a classic example, as Gavin and Emily have both pointed out. There are sometimes anticipated consequences, not because anyone wanted them to be, they just happened. So the quicker we can move forward with those, and everyone's aligned on that, the better. So yeah, I would just agree with Emily and Gavin on that.
Fantastic. And so thank you, everyone. I think, we're getting some sort of virtual, signs of like, shut it, you're over time. So I would like, once again, to thank you all, Ross Webster, Steve Wing, Emily Roberts, Andrew Buckman, and Gavin Stirrett for joining me today. And I will pass on the word again to our great host, David Goddard. Thank you.